For those of you who don't know me, my research is all about how coalitions shape people's thoughts, their feelings, their brains, and their behaviors. So I study how processes, for example, such as empathy and understanding, break down when the social context shifts from me and you acting as individual agents to us and them. So, other groups interacting with one another or individuals interacting as representatives of those groups. And I'm equally interested in the behavioral consequences of these processes breaking down, including discrimination, conflict, and aggression. So why I talk about groups at a morality and justice pre-conference? Well, I would argue that intergroup dynamics fundamentally reshape people's views of what is acceptable and fair, and therefore represent a critical boundary condition on our most cherished theories of morality and justice. And so that's why I'm here. So one thing with which I have been obsessed with several years now is context dependence, and specifically how it informs our social inferences. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to claim that social groups are woven very tightly into the fabric of our lives, shaping how we perceive, punish, cooperate with, how we learn from other individuals. The challenge for me is that I think that the dominant model of studying and seeking to understand intergroup dynamics has actually got things turned a bit the wrong way around. So what do I mean by that? Well, driven in part by the prominence of social identity theory and the minimal groups paradigm, in which you can get people to exhibit social bias, even with random assignment to teams, the contemporary intergroup literature has really emphasized the role of explicit category membership. So Black versus white targets or Rattlers versus Eagles in the classic Sharif studies in predicting intergroup attitudes and behavior. However, I believe this approach is limited, because social categories aren't fixed homogeneous entities, right? For one, the associations with specific categories will change over time. As an example, how the Italians and Irish became white in the US in the early 20th century by assimilating into Native and white communities. So they were not considered racialized as white prior to that time. Of course, allegiances between categories will also change over time. So take as another example, Americans and Germans relationships now versus say 80 years ago, right? And of course, those allegiances shifting are naturally going to change the nature of the attitudes and behavior that unfold in those intergroup contexts. And third, not all categories carry with them sort of psychological potency of purposive groups. So for example, even though Azim and I are both brunettes, we've never really been concerned about an uprising of brunettes and us banding together against the blondes, for example. So the other thing I want to argue is that studies based on social categories make it a bit difficult to infer from them anything about generalized group processes. For example, some, but not all, social categories are intrinsically confounded with differences in the visual appearance of targets. Many groups carry with them particular stereotypes and associated prejudices. Perceivers' familiarity with groups in question is going to vary, and so on and so forth. So to just sort of summarize this point succinctly, I don't know which aspects of, say, an interracial interaction are going to port over into an interpolitical party interaction, right? Finally, the category-based approach is limited because it's context insensitive, right? So it's going to break down as agents' goals or agents' other intersecting identities sort of become salient. You can consider as an example the adage, not all skin folk is kinfolk, or for example, widespread confusion as to how it is that so many Hispanic and Latinx voters supported Trump in the 2020 elections. So research that treats demographic categories as purposive groups is often going to run into these explanatory limitations and may ironically end up reinforcing stereotypes and the beliefs that these groups are, or these categories are social monoliths, and that we should treat them that way and have, that we should expect them to continue to act that way. So studying only explicit categories is unlikely to get us very far or in complete sense in the pursuit of understanding the general concepts of groups. So here is the puzzle that has seized me. What are the alternative cues to social group structure that are less subject to these limitations? Okay, so these ideas of coalition formation and reformation can be scaled up from individuals to make novel predictions at the intergroup level. So most of you, I'm assuming, are familiar with this visual illusion. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. When you look at the orange dots, you can't help but see the one on the right is larger. But of course, when I remove the orange dots around them or the context, it's very clear that they're the same size. So this is a bit of a hacky analogy, but it illustrates a fundamental tenet of our psychology, which is that context really matters. So this is true for judgments of all kinds, ranging from psychophysics to social cognition. Now, what does this reference dependence mean in a time of great demographic change? And can we build a more generalized model of how alliances will shift invariant to the groups in questions? So this is work that is joint with Vicky Fuca as well as Marco Tabellini. Vicky is at Stanford in political science and economy, and Marco is an economist at Harvard Business School. So the confluence of global political and economic upheaval with humanitarian and climate crises has immigrants and refugees on the move in unprecedented numbers, right? So the bulk of research on the effects of these kinds of demographic changes has really focused on how mobility impacts host country majority group members, either feelings about newcomers in particular, or their more general racial attitudes and policy preferences broadly. Now, one prevailing framework argues that there are really specific characteristics of these migrant refugees and local minoritized groups that are going to drive majority groups' responses to them. So examples include things like how skilled people presume the groups to be, their perceived foreignness, their competitiveness and status, and that these inferences are what's driving people's responses to them. There's a complementary alternative, though, that majority groups are sensitive to a more generalized cue or group feature that signals threat that is invariant to the groups in question. So please note that in this talk, I am going to continue to rely on the notion of categories in order to define these groups, but I hope to convince you that this work is really pushing us towards a more feature-centric rather than a category-centric way of thinking about conflict in intergroup contexts. Okay. So one such generalized threat feature that has garnered a lot of attention, particularly with increases in shifting demographics in both the US and Europe, is group size. The larger groups become, the less well they are liked. But the interesting thing about this is that this relationship is not so straightforward. So the first challenge is that people's beliefs may not reflect demographic reality. For example, people are very, very reliably overestimate the proportion of immigrant populations across many different contexts. A further complication is that size judgments of individual objects, of collectives, et cetera, they're reference dependent, and this is a domain general phenomenon. So one's estimate of the size of a thing or of a target is always going to be determined relative to what other targets are accessible, either in the environment or from memory. And that's why I gave you the Ebbinghaus illusion to kick off the talk. So it's not necessarily the case that new group growth is going to trigger threat. But then the question becomes, well, okay, so what they have to surpass the threshold, what is that threshold, right? Note also that because immigrants, refugees, and resident minority groups are not distributed evenly throughout our geography, different communities should exhibit distinct hierarchies of prejudice across different minoritized groups. So importing the concept of reference dependence as a driver of intergroup attitudes and behavior can really help us get some traction on how groups will change over time and vary across ecologies. And the other thing that's really nice about this approach is it pushes us beyond a binary dynamic. It's not just us versus them, it's us versus many thems in our social ecology. And that's something that's really lacking from a lot of our intergroup theorizing, with the exception of Maureen Craig and Jen Richardson are doing great work in this area, and John Dixon and his colleagues. But I want to join this tradition. So what I'm going to introduce to you today is the social group reference dependence hypothesis, which is just that majority groups members' reactions to any one group in their social ecology is going to depend on what other groups are also present. And so here I'm going to talk to you about how we tested a specific corollary of this general hypothesis. The prediction is that rather than being sensitive to the absolute size of any one minority group, communities of resident, and in this case, we're going to look specifically at white community members, will be sensitive to minoritized groups' relative rank in size, being most discriminating against whichever group represents the largest local minority, and less so as we go down the totem pole. So while people are demonstrably inaccurate in the judgments of absolute sizes of collectives, it turns out they're actually much more accurate in judgments of relative size of collectives, what's sometimes referred to as mapping versus metric knowledge. And so this, we think, is an instance of this phenomenon in the domain of demographics. Given humans' general sensitivity to rank information, even if they're incorrect about proportions, we predict that majority groups will be most discriminating again against whichever group is the largest minority, followed by the second largest, and so on, above and beyond the size of those groups. So there's going to be multiple inputs into threat. One could be group size, but above and beyond that, we're arguing that majority group members are going to be sensitive to this rank positioning. Okay, so how do we begin to test this? Well, we test the social group reference dependence hypothesis in the context of the United States. We focus on the majority group, specifically white people's treatment of and attitudes towards 4 minoritized racial ethnic groups in the US. That's specifically Black communities, Hispanic, Latinx communities, non-white, Asian communities, and Arab people. And so we use data from the US Census of the population between 1990 and 2010 to measure the size of each of those groups as a share of the total population. And therefore, from there, we can compute their rank in terms of their relative size at the county level across these decades. Now, that's our independent variable. What's our outcome variable? To examine discriminatory behavior against each of these minoritized groups, we're going to use data on hate crimes that's compiled by the FBI as part of the Uniform Crimes Reporting Program. So this data set is really interesting because it records also not just the nature of the crime, but also the bias motivation of each crime. So the data set will have a column that says, for example, as an entry, anti-Black, right? As well as the race of the perpetrator. So our first dependent variable is going to be the number of hate crimes committed by white offenders against a group in a given county and decade, expressed as a fraction of that county's total population. So the number of hate crimes per 100,000 inhabitants of that county. So we combine these two data sets to create a novel county group decade data set. And then we can study the relationship between hate crimes against a specific group, racial ethnic group, and that group's rank in terms of its size within its county within that time period. We also look at the effects of rank on self-reported attitudes towards 3 of the 4 groups, and that's specifically thermometer ratings, feelings thermometer ratings drawn from Project Implicit. And we test this in the US and the UK. Spoiler alert, it looks the same. It works exactly how you would expect it to. Interestingly, Project Implicit does not have data on feelings towards Hispanic/Latinx individuals. So these are going to be restricted to 3 groups, these findings relative to 4 groups. Okay. So the first thing we wanted to see just descriptively was whether there was any relationship between rank and hate crimes perpetrated against a group above and beyond that group's size. So this figure depicts how hate crimes on the y-axis against a racial group vary with that group's share of all minorities in a county, and whether that group is the largest, so blue dots, or second largest, red dots, in their county. So the question is, where the blue dots and the red dots overlap, are the blue dots higher than the red dots? So conditional on being exactly the same share of the population of the county, does being first versus second rate mean that you're more likely to get targeted with hate crimes? And it turns out this is apparent for Hispanic groups of any relative size, and it becomes increasingly clear for Asian people as their relative size increases, and for Black people as their relative size increases. Hold on, just one. Okay, so here's another way to look at the first order relationship. So this is the relationship between the incidence of hate crimes against a group. So here we have Black victims, Hispanic victims, and Asian victims. And then this is, so against that group and that group's rank in a county and decade for a narrow range around the threshold where the group switches from second to first. So the x-axis plots the difference in the size of a group from the size of that group that is the largest among the remaining minorities. So what we're doing here is basically what that line is telling you is when the group goes from being second, as indicated by negative values, to first, as indicated to the right side of that line on the x-axis, to positive values. So the pattern in the figure is pretty convincing, right? Counties just to the right of the 0 threshold register more hate crimes against the group compared to counties just to the left of the threshold. So if rank had no explanatory power for victimization rates over and above a group's size, this relationship between hate crimes per capita and the difference from the largest to the second largest group should be totally continuous around the 0 threshold, right? That should just be a perfectly straight line, but instead we have a discontinuity pattern. So the main takeaway from both of these descriptive findings is that group size and rank matter and may be separable pathways by which threat is registered. But one thing you may be wondering is, well, these relationships are likely spurious, right? For example, Hispanic and Latinx people are the largest minority in all Southwestern states and counties. So persistent negative views of that group in that region could just be driven by that region's proximity to the border, right? So that there are all these other third variables that could be explaining these kinds of relationships. All right, so what we did is we conducted a fixed analysis to deal with a fixed effects analysis to deal with a lot of this. So this analysis accounts for any county-specific factor, observable or unobservable, that can affect the frequency of hate crimes that does not vary over time and does not vary by group. So this is a county's persistent levels of outgroup intolerance or other characteristics that could correlate with it, such as its geographical location, its economic conditions, and so on and so forth. We also account for time invariant factors specific to each minoritized group that are common across all counties in the US. So you can think of this as sort of at the level of the US, right? So we know that there are higher average levels of prejudice against Hispanic and Black people compared to Asians across the country as a whole, right? But this is going to control for any group specific effects. So we're going to be testing for rank effects above and beyond this. Finally, we net out decade specific effects or shocks that might change community members' behavior towards those minoritized groups in general. So economic shocks in this versus that decade that could increase scapegoating towards all minoritized groups in question. Now, crucially, we always control for a nonlinear function of the size of each minoritized group. So we include all the way up to a quartic polynomial in group size as a share of the population, which again, the function of doing this is that it isolates the rank effect from a more general size effect, which has previously been identified in the literature in a number of different papers for like the last 80 years, basically. So controlling for group size in this way ensures that whatever effects we identify are not driven by different base rates of victimization across groups and counties. So even if groups, attacks towards groups occurred at random, the probability of hate crime perpetrators randomly encountering a member of the largest group would already be captured by these group size effects. So it's not just, you're most likely to run into a member of the largest group in the community. Whatever we're looking at is above and beyond that. I hope that that's clear. So in our estimations, we use the smallest group as the reference category, and we report estimates of the other three values of rank. So I'm about to show you the first data slide from the fixed effects analyses. And we cluster standard errors at the county level to account for any serial correlation within a county across groups and over time. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is the effect of rank on the x-axis as compared to the fourth largest group in a county over time. And then the 95% confidence intervals of the marginal effect of size rank on hate crimes per 100,000 residents committed by white offenders. So again, the reference group is always the fourth rank group. What we see here is that conditional on a minoritized group size, so above and beyond size, the rank of that group is still predictive of its victimization rate. So a group experiences approximately one more hate crime per 100,000 inhabitants when it moves from fourth to first place in terms of the rank distribution within a county. And this effect corresponds to roughly 107% increase of the average county level victimization rate of a group across the 3 decades that we observe. The second and the third largest minorities are also in higher danger of victimization relative to the fourth. The first is still higher than the second and third, and the second and the third are not statistically distinguishable. Now, we probe the robustness of this in about 1 million ways because, of course, it's not experimental. So first, again, because of those fixed effects that we included, the rank effect does not merely capture rising prejudice against any one group that happens to be growing over time in the US in the time period that we're looking. So, for example, the effect is not driven exclusively by high Hispanic Latinx growth in the US. Neither does rank capture changing characteristics of counties over time, because again, we have these fixed effects of both decade and the county by decade interaction. Next, our findings are not an artifact of the nonlinear effects of relative group size. Turns out that non-parametrically controlling for group size actually increases the magnitude of the rank effect without affecting the significance of our findings. Rank remains predictive of a group's victimization rate, independent of whether we measure it as a relative size of the total population of a county or as a proportion of the minoritized population of the county. And I want to argue that this is a really stringent test because the share of minoritized population is just a continuous conversion of the rank measure, right? So if I tell you that there's, this group A makes up 50% of the minoritized population here, group B is 30%, and group C is 20%. That's just a continuation, that's just a continuous measure of first, second, and third rank. But we find that our effects of rank persist above and beyond including that as a control. We find that the effective rank is robust at controlling for the relative group sizes of all other minoritized groups. So it doesn't matter if the next group down is particularly large or small, and for the difference in relative size between a minoritized group and the group immediately below it in rank, what we might call its nearest competitor. Finally, rank does not simply capture faster growing minoritized groups in some counties. In fact, our effects remain robust to controlling for county-specific growth rate of each minoritized group size. A few other things that aren't explaining rank here. So rank does not capture the effect of a group size in neighboring counties or in the broader geographic region because it persists even when we include a state by group by decade fixed effect. The effective rank is not driven by rural or low population density counties. In fact, our results are even stronger when we weight by county population to increase the influence of more urbanized locations. And finally, we find no indication that the effective rank is driven by reporting bias in the UCR data. So we continue to observe a significant effective rank when we restrict analyses only to violent hate crimes for which reliability of reporting is actually higher. The other thing this addresses is any concerns about, well, maybe some groups are targeted with more or less violent hate crimes, but you're treating those equivalently. Nope, if you restrict it only to violent hate crimes, you see the same effects of rank. Last couple of robustness checks. Rank also displays a relatively consistent effect across divergent geographic subsamples. So if you take the macro regions as defined by the US Census, we find that, again, the largest minority is most likely to be victimized across all US macro regions, with the effect being somewhat attenuated in the Northeast. Examining a smaller unit of regional analysis, the effective rank does not depend on the distribution of minoritized groups within a county. So the largest minority group is equally likely to be victimized in counties that have high versus low racial diversity. And in the paper, we provide evidence against any sort of county group specific changes in the behavior of minoritized group members as they increase in rank that could invite or precede an increase in attacks against them. So we don't find in the FBI database that there is any indication that as a group increases in rank, that they commit more violent crimes, that they commit more hate crimes themselves, either in general or against the white community members. So it doesn't seem to be that there is anything that's changing in the behavior of these groups as they increase in rank, which would provoke more aggression amongst white perpetrators. So a remaining potential concern is that these estimates from our fixed effects models might be influenced that both hate crimes toward a particular racial or ethnic group and that group's rank in a county distribution are simultaneously related to a third factor. So just to illustrate this, you could find that even accounting for a county's location in the US's South, counties with a stronger legacy of enslaved labor relative to those with a lower past dependency on slave labor within that same region are more biased against Black people today. But in those same counties, Black people have consistently remained the largest minority. So that there's labor dependency and historical third variables that are driving both of these things and are accounting for this relationship. So to address these and similar possibilities, we exploit the fact that groups experience changes in their rank within the same county over time. For example, between 1990 and 2010, Hispanic and Latinx groups rose in rank on average across the entire US, while other minoritized groups' ranks fell. However, this pattern, this average pattern masks a wide variation, both in terms of the direction of rank switches across these 4 different groups, and also their spatial distribution across the country. So again, on average in the US, we see a big tick up in, let's say, Hispanic groups going from second to first place. However, that varies a lot depending on where you're looking. So what we do here is we now decide to look at the effect of rank switch on hate crimes. So exploiting variation in rank switches across groups, we estimate the effect of rank by only comparing victimization rates within group county cells across decades. So intuitively, what the strategy is doing is it compares the change in victimization suffered by two minoritized groups whose relative size in a given decade grows by the same amount, but who experience a difference in change in how their rank is changing. So for example, in one case, the group will go from second to first, whereas this group will have no change, right? So what I'm going to show you here, the red dots are the baseline data that I've shown you already, and the blue dots are the new data. So this is rank switch data. So what we're finding is that even in the rank switch analysis, rank continues to predict the frequency of group-specific hate crimes. And that's holding the change in relative size across 2 decades constant. Moving from last to first predicts that the minoritized group will experience an increase in the frequency of hate crimes that targeted equal to a frequency increase of 64% of the average victimization rate across counties. One thing that I think is really interesting to note here from a psychological and coalitional perspective is that the rank effects are roughly symmetric. So the increase in victimization that a group experiences when moving from second to first is roughly equal to the magnitude to the decrease of hate crimes it experiences when it moves from first to second place. So this suggests a substitution in prejudice across groups. And it's really interesting to me because it's consistent with this notion that majority group members are sort of distributing a fixed amount of discrimination across minority targets. So said another way, this kind of looks like a reformation of coalitions when we're more violent against a new foe and we become simultaneously more tolerant of an old one, right? Because we could continue to attack everybody on all sides, but that's not what appears to come out of these data. Now, again, these are the IAT thermometer ratings. So the effect is flipped here, right? Because more negative values mean more negative attitudes. And we only have 3 groups because, again, there's no Hispanic Latinx data in Project Implicit. Of course, there are a lot of other problems with this, self-selection and so on, but just to demonstrate that it generalizes across measures and also across contexts, what we find is that of the remaining 3 groups, Black, Asian, and Arab populations, attitudes towards the first ranked and second ranked group are significantly lower in both the US and UK when compared to the third ranked group. So it looks similar for a completely different outcome measure and generalizes across 2 different contexts, which gives us more confidence that this is a generalized phenomenon. Okay, so what we observe is an increase in group size-based rank relative to other minoritized groups is associated with a higher likelihood of being targeted with hate crimes and more negative attitudes. Now, one thing you may be wondering is, again, why are individuals sensitive to group size rank when they're so bad at judging minorities' absolute group size or even proportions of the population? Well, these rank transformations of distribution information actually represent a form of efficient coding that's present across many domains of decision-making and are part of a very general pattern of reasoning about proportions, independent of the domain under consideration. So human estimates of proportions in general reflect representations that have sort of, the best way to describe it is transformed to look like into log odds. So this transformation distorts proportions, making smaller proportions look high, be estimated or represented as higher, and large proportions get estimated as lower. But it leaves ordinal judgments intact. And that's why we think that rank could, part of the reason that rank continues to have this impact above and beyond group size. So how does this rank ordering translate into discrimination? Well, we speculate that people begin from the premise that they have finite resources with which to defend their groups and attack other groups, and that this then generates a rank ordering of threat, basically ranked from the greatest threat to the least urgency, right? So in principle, people could remain staunchly negative, keep negative attitudes and behavior towards every group, every outgroup in their environment, but they would end up in practice completely surrounded by competitors, which is a tough way to live, right? So one strategy may be to infer new groupings. So you become relatively more inclusive and less towards less threatening outgroups. And again, strategically, this makes sense and is nicely reflected in these rank symmetry ratings I just shared with you. So this comports with dynamics that we're seeing play out in real time, in addition to these sort of historical data. This is a clipping taken from an article from just 2 months ago where they found that many school districts with critical race theory battles were the ones that were diversifying most quickly. Now, we find that growth rate is not accounting for rank effects, but it is related, right? And so if we were to rerun this analysis with rank, we may find that this is exactly what's happening here and what's driving some of the kerfuffle around critical race theory in schools. But our framework also makes novel predictions about how demographic shifts may affect coalitional structure in the years to come. So for instance, Asian Americans continue to be the US's fastest growing racial category, with immigration being a major driver of this growth. As Hispanic and Asian populations continue to grow in the US, counties with the greatest relative increases in these populations may experience a change over the features that matter for prejudice. So for example, they may shift away from skin tone to, say, language as the primary coalitional boundary. And relatedly, Asian Americans' tenuous status as model minorities may wane as their populations increase, specifically in places where they begin to outnumber other minoritized groups. And we've certainly seen an uptick in hate crimes against Asians in America, or Asian Americans, in the last couple of years. So, I'm hoping, obviously, that this doesn't come to pass for anybody, but this is the prediction. These are the predictions that are generated by the model. And finally, a broader theoretical contribution of this framework and the current findings is that they dispel the notion that attitudes and behaviors towards social categories are fixed or somehow derived only from categories' essentialized properties, that there's something in the categories that elicits this behavior from other people. And this matters because it turns out that when we know when and why prejudice and discrimination are flexibly deployed, people feel more empowered to combat it. So with that, I just want to thank my funding sources and all of you, and I'm happy to take questions now.